Hi, and welcome to our second video in our series on psychosocial hazards. My name is Michael Terry, I'm from Momentum Safety and Ergonomics, and this is the 5-Minute Safety Series. In today's video, we are going to be looking much closer at these hazards and really trying to drill down, understand them a little bit more, and see whether we as a workplace really need to tackle them. All right, so before we go too far, we should really try to understand what the potential harm here is. So a hazard is always something that has the potential to cause harm. And in physical hazards, that's relatively easy to understand. In psychological hazards, it's not quite so easy. What is the harm that we're talking about here? Well, the classic ones that we talk about, and this is not an exhaustive list, are things like anxiety, depression, it could be burnout, it could be post-traumatic stress disorder, or even something as serious as suicide is all the sorts of harms that we're trying to prevent by managing these hazards so much better. As a workplace, do you really have an issue with these hazards? Some of the things I like to look for to try and work out whether my workplace is at risk here is, do we have any reports? And they can be surveys that are done by, for example, a HR department, or even a survey that has been administered by you in health and safety. And we can give you some links to external surveys at the end of this in the description. It might be just individual reports or even report. One report needs to absolutely be thoroughly investigated because this is a very commonly underreported area. It might be some other signs like high absenteeism or high staff turnover or lots of overtime, and particularly if any of these things are increasing. That's always a good sign that you might have some issues there. Well, finally, if you've had workers' compensation claims for psychosocial issues in the past, particularly if those issues are not fully resolved, you might need to have a bit of a think about how we manage psychosocial hazards in our workplace. But finally, the thing that really is the obvious one is that, are you putting workers into hazardous situations? Situations where we know tend to more commonly lead to these harms that we talked about earlier. So let's have a look about what some of those things actually are. So I'm going to call these risk factors or even maybe sources of psychosocial hazards. And the first one I really think about is the work environment. It may not be specifically the cause, but it certainly could increase or exacerbate some of the other things that we talk about. So we might talk about things like noisy work environments, or hot or cold, or very uncomfortable because of the amount of PPE that people are wearing. These will be things to consider if we're looking at psychosocial hazards in our workplace. Probably one of the big ones is the nature of work or the work design. It could be things like in a manufacturing environment, for example, where we have very repetitive or low control type situations where a worker may feel that they don't really have any agency, they don't have any ability to influence how things happen, and maybe feel part of machinery. Classically, these are the sorts of things that are known to be risk factors for psychosocial hazards. Or another obvious one is exposure to violence, either physical or verbal. And we know some workplaces have this just by the type of work that we do. And they're typically workplaces where we have a high human interaction, and particularly certain groups are much more at risk of this. It could be a customer, an unhappy customer, or it could be a client that's got their own health or mental health issues as well. In aged care and disability care, this is a known risk factor for sure. Now, another consideration here is workplace relationships. And here the most obvious one is bullying and harassment. It is an important issue, but there are others that we need to consider as well. And it might be something as simple as manager relationships with their employees. Are the employees being heard, recognized, and is there equity in the workplace? These are often things that can be triggered for psychological harm or psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Well, the last one I really want to sort of mention here is significant change in the workplace, and we've seen lots of people over time struggle to deal with this sort of change, and without a good change management process, we can definitely be predisposing people to the risk of psychosocial hazards. Now, it might be exposure to trauma, for example, or witnessing a traumatic incident, for example. And I do recall in my past a truck driver who was a witness and somewhat involved in a motor vehicle accident that had a fatality. He was physically injured, but it was his psychological injuries or harms that had the biggest impact on his life. Now, the list that we just discussed is not exhaustive. If you are looking for more information about all the different situations that can lead to psychosocial hazards, I would refer you to the Code of Practice, which has a much more extensive list and a lot more information about these than we've covered here today. In our next video, we're going to be having a closer look at how we can assess these, how do we control these hazards and reduce the risk if we do have them in the workplace. I look forward to seeing you then in the 5-Minute Safety series.